As we move into the second part of our study of Beowulf and medieval culture, we'll be taking a look at some of the background to what it was like to live sometime around 500 to maybe 800 AD. So if you remember yesterday, we talked a lot about the development of the English language and how Beowulf is a Scandinavian tale that's brought to us and told and written down in Old English by a couple of anonymous monks. We don't know their names. Manuscripts pretty much have been destroyed except for one or two remaining ones. And so what I want to look at is, as these German groups, the Angles, the Saxons, the Utes, and the Frisians, as they began to move into England and make inroads, they brought with them their culture, which included their traditions, their rituals, their belief systems, their gods. All of that was part of this makeup of what would become medieval England. Now, there's some terms that we want to be familiar with in our study of Beowulf as a hero. And once again, you see, here's another excerpt. You can see where the manuscript has been burned at some of the edges, so some of it is lost to us. All told, the reading is probably about 60 to 80 pages, maybe, of text that we have left. And who knows what other documents may have been lost in those fires. So when we start to study a work like Beowulf or any of the heroes that you're looking at, it's important to get a feel for the Zeitgeist, which is the spirit of the times. What was it like to actually be a warrior in Beowulf's mead hall? And we learn some of the terminology as we kind of go through with this. So our mead hall is the name given to like the gathering place. So this would be ultimately the forerunner for the castle. The mead hall, mead is a drink of fermented honey. It's like a beer, kind of like a porter beer. You can still find it if you go to the Renfest. You can see it there. But this was the gathering place for the king or the clan leader and all of his warriors. This is where meetings were held. This is where stories were told. This is where treasures were given. War plans were made. And to get a feel for what this looked like, we have some tapestries that remain, and we can kind of see kind of the setup of this place. All right, so there you see on the screen, that would be, this area here would be your king. Okay, obviously you're a clan leader. And then as you kind of think about it going through, you've got several retainers. Okay, these people are called thanes. All right, that's another word for warrior. Okay. You see it's a very primitive wooden structure. Giant, you can kind of make it out behind here. This is a giant tapestry, which ultimately would become the forerunner for the flag. This would be woven, and it would tell the great stories of the battles that the clan had fought and won. The heroes are recounted there. And we'll talk real quickly. There were basically three ways to attain immortality. One of them was, of course, to have children. Okay, having kids passes the gene pool, so you're guaranteed, immortality status through your offspring. The second way was to have the gods intervene, and that happens in stories like Hercules, where you're gathered up and you're taken into the afterworld. Have the gods intervene. The third way was to become immortal through stories. The stories that are told, and that was the way that Beowulf chooses. So when we study him, he has no children, like Achilles. Like Achilles, he wants to be remembered, and that is his primary concern, is how he can outlast death and continue on. And we still, in a way, it's still working, because we're still telling the story of Beowulf as we go. All right, some other features here. You see this figure that's right over here. Okay, this figure is called a scop. Okay, he is the storyteller, or if you want another word for him, would be bard. Okay, now his role is very important. Basically what he does is he makes and keeps and composes the history of the tribe. So he would be accompanied by several background singers known as gleemen, who were apprenticed Scops. They were trying to find their way to become Scops and storytellers for the tribe. The other figure I want to point out to you is this woman, the only woman in there. She would probably be the figure of the queen. Very important role for her was to identify the pecking order of which warrior was the top first knight. And so as she would go around and serve mead to these different warriors, she chose the one that would be number one. Okay, and he would be served first. The king of obviously first, and then the second man would be served second and third and so forth. So kind of an important role she can kind of delegate. So ultimately this will advance into a code of chivalry where women, particularly queens, are worshipped and kind of given great stock. Okay, all right. So kind of moving on, some of the other terms we have, we talked about the mead hall, we talked about the Scop. Didn't talk about the Witan. The Witan is the council. This would be a group of elders, a group of warriors who would advise the king. They would be surrounding him. They're kind of like the cabinet in the presidential setup. Now, some of the concepts that kept people going, there are two key words that we'll work with. The Nordic people believed in the concept of fate, which they called Wyrd, W-Y-R-D. And that was the idea that you never knew what tomorrow was going to bring. So you'll hear Beowulf say repeatedly that I may die, okay? This battle may claim me. And it was the idea that he was perfectly at ease and comfortable with dying. He just wanted to make sure that he would be remembered. And so the idea that you do not get to choose your hour of choosing is kind of the mindset that these warriors had. Now, the other key idea for this warrior culture, one thing that made it so successful, was the fact that they had a concept called comitatus, okay? And comitatus, quite simply, just means loyalty to king above all else. So when you pledge what's called an oath of fealty, you are pledging complete allegiance to your Lord above all else. So that means if he calls upon you to even slay your own kin, you would be willing to do that. And we do have several manuscripts, including the Cinewolf manuscript, that talk and demonstrate warriors killing cousins and uncles and sometimes even brothers because their king has ordered them to do so. And so this comitatus is kind of what we might call a blood oath. Okay, it ties you and bonds you to the king. Now, to ensure that blood oath, the king became a gift giver. Okay, so if you've ever wondered why we have such a gift-giving culture, if you've ever wondered why you feel compelled when you receive a gift unexpectedly to give back even a little bit more, the reason is it cements a relationship of obligation. So by giving gifts, the king is ensuring that these warriors are obligated to serve him. And it's one of the reasons you give a gift sometimes, and it's maybe unwittingly, but there's a motive behind it. And that motive is cementing the friendship, cementing the loyalty, cementing the relationship. And so gift giving was a huge deal for these people. Okay, and now we'll get into two final traits, and that is why men don't cry. And this goes back to our Nordic heritage, these German tribes coming over. They had to learn how to repress their feelings because they were a warlike culture. Your closest friend, your brother, your fellow warrior was likely to be killed next to you. And you yourself would be killed if you spent time grieving. So you learned how to suppress that rage, suppress that anger, suppress that grief on the battlefield so you could do your job. And then later, you would release that in some kind of funeral rite. And we'll see this in Beowulf at the end after the battle with the dragon, that's where the lamentation, that's the mourning ritual comes in. Okay, and the last but not least is the idea of being a good host. Okay, so you probably noticed that when you go have friends over, your parents are often nicer to the friends than they have ever been to you. And this goes all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon culture. A guest in your home got double protection. For someone to be killed, injured, harmed in any way in your home, was considered a big taboo. And the reason for that is because it was built upon the hope that if you are kind to these guests coming in, they in turn will be obligated to be kind to you and to yours when you in turn visit them. And so everything's built around this kind of hierarchy structure of we're going to do nice to you so that you will do nice to us. And it was kind of a system that just ingrained itself into the British and later the American kind of concept of what it means to be, a good neighbor. Okay, so let's look real quick at just a couple of Anglo-Saxon ideals. All right, these are motivating factors for these guys. Obviously, a love of glory and a love of gaining fame. Comitatus, we've mentioned. Okay, there was a reverence for womanhood. They were the life givers. They were also the ones who controlled ranking order, as we talked about with the queen. These people, and this would bleed into America too, they would have a great love of personal freedom. They were nomadic in some ways. They did build structures to stand, but they understood that they could be raided, they could be invaded, they might have to move. We had the open-handed hospitality, do unto others as you would want them doing to you, in spades. And then you also had truth. Even though you'll see these characters making these wild boasts, like Beowulf will talk about swimming in the ocean for 7 days and battling sea monsters at the bottom of the ocean. You know that he's like lying out through his teeth, but he's boasting to gain his fame. And there's an element of truth within there, okay? And they hated to be called liars, all right? And again, suppression of sentiments until you got to a more appropriate place, which was not the battlefield, all right? And then last but not least, you see a list of different characteristics and qualities that these warriors served. And they lived in a harsh climate, and they lived under harsh conditions. I mean, death was around them everywhere. Our average life expectancy may have been somewhere near 40 years. Women could expect maybe to be pregnant 18, 19 times during their lives and have maybe one child survive into adulthood. Plagues were rampant, diseases were uncontrolled, so it was just a hard way of living, and so they learned how to respond to that. As far as religion goes, they were what we would call pantheists. They worshipped basically nature, and they had multiple gods, each god in charge of a different piece of nature, a different piece of the puzzle. And because of that, they had a special love for nature and for the sea. Okay? All right. And by and large, we get our idea of like being sensible, sober, common sense drives us. All of that comes from this Anglo-Saxon heritage. So if you've ever wondered how you got to be who you are, part of that comes from your past history and culture that give rise to it. So when we try to figure out what is the American culture, this is a piece of it. It's not certainly all of it, but it's certainly a piece of it.